It's ours now, you know. The table. The words, delivered with a careless lilt that belied their weight, hung in the air between us, thick with the scent of lemon polish and old wood. My brother, David, stood in the doorway of the dining room, his shadow stretching across the worn Persian rug, a smug satisfaction playing on his lips. He'd always had a way of claiming things, of assuming ownership, but this felt different. More definitive. My normal life, the one that hummed along on a quiet frequency, had always had a faint static of David's entitlement. Our parents, bless their hearts, had a way of smoothing over his rough edges, of prioritizing his comfort. He's sensitive, you know, my mother would say, her voice laced with an anxious apology for his every transgression. My father, a man of few words, would simply sigh and let David have the bigger slice of cake, the better seat, the first pick. I learned early on that arguing was like shouting into a hurricane, exhausting and ultimately futile. I found solace in my own quiet pursuits of reading, gardening, the steady rhythm of my work as a librarian. I learned to build walls, to insulate myself from the petty dramas that David seemed to conjure from thin air. I remember one summer, years ago. Our parents were selling the lake house, a place filled with a lifetime of memories. David, then in his early 20s, had declared he wanted the antique grandfather clock. It had been in our family for generations, a silent sentinel marking the hours of our lives. My mother, hesitant, mentioned that I had always admired it, had even sketched it once in my art class. David's response was immediate and absolute. "Well, I saw it first," he'd said, his voice hardening. "And I'm going to have it." There was no discussion, no compromise. The clock, heavy and imposing, was loaded onto a truck and disappeared from its familiar corner. I never asked for it. I just felt a familiar ache, a dull throb of what could have been, what should have been mine by sentiment, if not by declared intent. Then there was the inheritance. When our father passed, the will was clear, the house and its contents were to be divided equally between David and me. It seemed fair, equitable. But David had other ideas. He wanted the house. The house, he claimed, for stability. He proposed a buyout. I was offered a sum that felt insultingly low, a fraction of what the property was worth, especially considering the years I'd spent helping our parents maintain it, painting the trim, weeding the overgrown garden. "It's just easier this way," he'd insisted, his hand resting on my arm, his touch slick with insincerity. "Think of the hassle, the lawyers. You wouldn't want that, would you?" The veiled threat, the assumption that I was too weak or too overwhelmed to handle such matters, stung more than the unfair valuation. I'd swallowed my anger, the taste of bile rising in my throat, and agreed to the buyout, a sum I knew would never truly compensate for the loss of a shared history. The dining room table was an oak behemoth, scarred with the history of countless family meals, spilled drinks, and hushed arguments. It was the heart of our childhood home, a place where traditions were forged and relationships were tested. It had been designated, in our parents' gentle way, as something to be shared, passed down. For years, it had sat in my parents' dining room, a silent fixture. After their passing, and the ensuing division of their belongings, David had made a point of mentioning he was looking forward to having it in his own home. I'd heard it before, that possessive tone, that casual appropriation of something that wasn't solely his. I'd filed it away, another instance of David's unwavering belief in his own inherent right to take whatever he desired. The day David made his pronouncement, it was a Saturday. I'd come over to collect a few more boxes of sentimental items, old photo albums, my mother's knitting needles. The house, now officially mine after the buyout, was quiet, echoing with the ghosts of their presence. I was carefully wrapping a ceramic robin when I heard the crunch of tires on gravel. David. He usually called, but this was typical of his spontaneous, boundary-blurring arrivals. I found him in the dining room, already surveying the scene with that proprietary gleam in his eyes. He'd walked in, made a beeline for the table, and placed his hand on its polished surface as if claiming territory. "It's ours now, you know." The table. I stopped, the ceramic robin poised in my hands. The air in the room seemed to thicken, to become heavy with his words. I looked at him, really looked at him. He was oblivious to the tremor in my hand, to the sudden stillness that had fallen over me. He was basking in the glow of his perceived victory, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was about to shift. "Yes, David," I said, my voice remarkably steady. "It is ours." I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain the legalities, the paperwork, the finality of the transfer. I simply let his words hang there, a prelude to the unraveling he was so expertly orchestrating. He took my quiet affirmation as a concession, a surrender. "Good," he said, nodding, a satisfied smirk playing on his lips. "I was worried you'd try to claim it. You're always so sentimental." He ran his hand over the wood again, a possessive gesture that sent a chill down my spine. "It'll look great in my new place. Matches everything." I watched him, a strange calm settling over me. The years of silent endurance, of swallowing pride, of accepting his casual dismissals, had forged something hard and resilient within me. I had played the role of the accommodating sibling for too long. The quiet life I'd built had given me the space to observe, to strategize, to understand the subtle levers of power. I turned back to my boxes, my movements deliberate. "Yes, David," I repeated, my voice a low hum. "It is." I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I could feel his self-satisfaction radiating through the room, a palpable aura of entitlement. He believed he had one, as always. The next few days were a blur of meticulous planning. I didn't confide in anyone. The thought of involving flying monkeys, of having my carefully laid plans dissected and potentially sabotaged, was anathema to me. This was a personal reckoning, a debt that had been accumulating for years, and I intended to collect it myself. I visited a specialist furniture mover, a discreet company known for their professionalism and discretion. I showed them photographs, detailed measurements, and provided a precise address where the table was currently located. I also made a series of phone calls, each one a small, calculated step. The day of the execution was a Tuesday. I waited until late morning, when I knew David would be at his office, immersed in his own manufactured importance. The weather was overcast, a fittingly muted backdrop for the quiet drama unfolding. The specialist movers arrived at the house with a large, unmarked van and an air of silent efficiency. They worked with a practiced grace, their movements economical and precise. I stood in the hallway, watching as they carefully dismantled the legs of the oak table, wrapped each piece in protective padding, and loaded them onto the van. There was no fuss, no drama. It was a transaction, swift and clean. As the last piece was secured, one of the movers handed me a receipt. I thanked them, my voice barely a whisper, and watched as the van pulled away, disappearing down the street. Later that afternoon, I received a frantic call. It was David. His voice, usually so self-assured, was strained, bordering on panic. "Where is it? Where's the table?" I answered calmly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Which table, David?" There was a pause, a frustrated sigh. "You know what table I mean. The dining room table. It's gone." "Is it?" I said, feigning a mild surprise. "That's odd. I assumed it had been moved. I thought you were handling the logistics. You said it was ours. You said you'd let me have it." His voice was rising, the entitlement cracking under the strain of confusion. "I did say it was ours, David," I replied, my gaze sweeping over the empty space where the table had once stood, a space now filled with a quiet sense of liberation. "And it is. I just decided it would be more suitable for my own home. I've always loved it. It holds so many memories for me." A strangled sound came from the other end of the line. You sold it? You gave it away?" "Not exactly," I said, letting the silence stretch, allowing him to fill it with his own dawning horror. "I merely exercised my ownership. I had it moved to my residence." He sputtered, his words tumbling out in a jumbled mess of accusations and disbelief. But that's not fair. You can't just do that. Can't I? I asked, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching my lips. The paperwork is all in order, David. The house, the contents, it's all mine now. Every last piece. I was referring, of course, to the house I had inherited and then bought him out of, meticulously ensuring all documentation reflected my sole ownership. The table had been part of the contents of that house. The furious texts and increasingly desperate calls began that evening. My phone buzzed incessantly with messages from David, each one more enraged than the last. Then came the calls from other family members, the self-appointed mediators, the ones who always sided with David, citing his fragile ego and my stoic nature. They pleaded, they cajoled, they threatened subtle social exclusion. I didn't answer. I didn't engage. I simply let the storm rage on, a detached observer. I pictured David, pacing his empty dining room, his grand plans for a family heirloom now nothing but a cruel, hollow joke. His face, I imagined, would have contorted from disbelief to rage, then to a cold, dawning realiza. Tie-in of his own powerlessness. He, who had always assumed he could take what he wanted, had been outmaneuvered by the quiet sister he'd always underestimated. The social consequences were already rippling. Whispers would follow him, stories of his entitlement and my calm, calculated retribution. He had wanted to claim the family legacy, the tangible symbol of our shared history. And I, with a few precise movements, had ensured that he now had nothing but the bitter taste of his own avarice. The table now sits in my sunlit dining room. It's a constant reminder, not of David's defeat, but of my own quiet reclaiming. There's a profound peace in knowing that what is rightfully mine, in sentiment and in law, is finally where it belongs. The silence in my home is no longer a silence of resignation, but a silence of resolution.